The evening began with a feeling Sarah could not name. A light pressure in her chest that followed her as she moved through the kitchen. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, and every sound felt sharper, as if the house itself was waiting. Omar had mentioned the dinner casually that morning, while tying his shoes as if it were nothing more than an ordinary plan. An old friend, passing through the city, just for one night. Sarah had smiled and agreed, but the unease stayed with her all day. It's quiet and persistent. Sarah and Omar had been married for 7 years. Their life was calm, built on routines that rarely surprised them. Morning tea together, short messages. During the day, quiet evenings spent in the same room, each lost in their own thoughts. It wasn't a loud love, but it was steady, and Sarah had always believed that steadiness was enough. She trusted Omar, not blindly, but with the confidence that came from time and shared effort. As she cooked, Sarah thought about the word old friend. It carried weight. Old meant history, shared memories, moments that existed before her. She told herself that everyone had a past, and that marriage did not erase it. Still, she found herself checking the mirror more than once, smoothing her hair, adjusting her clothes, wanting to look put together without knowing why it mattered so much. When the doorbell rang, her heart jumped. Omar went to open it, and Sarah wiped her hands before following him into the living room. The man standing at the door was taller than she expected, with a calm posture and observant eyes. He smiled when he saw her, not wide or careless, but thoughtful, as if he were taking her in slowly. "This is Yusuf," Omar said, "my friend from years ago." Yusuf greeted her politely, thanking her for having him. His voice was gentle, controlled, and there was something familiar about the way he spoke, though she was certain they had never met before. Sarah invited him inside, and as he stepped into the house, the air seemed to shift just slightly, like a door opening somewhere deep inside her thoughts. They sat at the table soon after. The food was warm, the plates neatly arranged, and for a few minutes the conversation flowed easily. Yusuf talked about his travels, the places he had lived, the work that kept him moving from one city to another. Omar added details now and then, but his usual ease was missing. He spoke less, laughed less, and kept his eyes on his plate more than on either of them. Sarah noticed everything. Yusuf, on the other hand, watched quietly. Aha! He listened with attention, nodding at the right moments, asking Sarah questions about her work, her interests, her days. Nothing he said crossed a line, yet his interest felt deeper than simple politeness. When she answered, he listened as if her words mattered more than the sound of his own voice. As the meal continued, Yusuf began sharing stories from the past, college days, late nights, dreams that once felt possible and now felt distant. He spoke of Omar with warmth, but also with a sense of loss, like someone remembering a version of a person who no longer existed. "We thought we'd take on the world," Yusuf said with a soft smile. "Back then, everything felt open." Omar shifted in his seat. "Things change," he replied quickly. "Yes," Yusuf said. "They do, but some things stay with you." The words lingered in the air longer than they should have. Sarah felt like she was sitting between two versions of her husband. The man she knew, careful and reserved, and another man she was only beginning to glimpse through Yusuf's memories. It made her uncomfortable in a way she couldn't explain, as if she were being gently pushed aside by a shared past she did not belong to. She tried to bring the conversation back to the present, asking Yusuf about his plans, where he was heading next. He answered, but his gaze returned to her often, thoughtful and unreadable. There was no smile now, only a quiet intensity that made her feel seen in a way she was not used to. Omar excused himself to refill his glass, leaving Sarah and Yusuf alone at the table for a brief moment. The silence felt heavier than noise. Yusuf looked at her, then looked away, as if holding back words. "You've built a peaceful home," he said finally. Sarah nodded. "We try." "He's changed," Yusuf added. "In some ways, for the better." Something about that sentence felt incomplete, as if another truth hid behind it. Before she could ask what he meant, Omar returned and the moment passed. After dinner, Sarah began clearing the table. Omar offered to help, but Yusuf insisted, picking up plates and following her into the kitchen. The space felt smaller with him there, not threatening, but charged. He stood close enough for her to sense his presence without touching her. "You're very kind," he said. "He's lucky." Sarah thanked him, unsure why his words unsettled her. She was used to being told she was kind. It had never felt like a question before. When they returned to the living room, Omar seemed restless. He checked his phone, paced slightly, then suggested tea. Yusuf agreed, but his attention remained fixed on Sarah, as if he were trying to understand something about her or about himself as the evening stretched on. The conversation grew quieter, more careful. Laughter faded. Words became measured. Sarah felt as though she were watching a scene unfold without knowing her role in it. She sensed something unspoken moving between the two men, something heavy with history and emotion. At one point, Yusuf mentioned a woman from the past, someone Omar had once been close to. The room tightened instantly. Omar cut him off with a short laugh and changed the subject. But the damage was done. Sarah felt a sharp awareness settle in her chest. This was not just nostalgia. This was unfinished business. Yusuf apologized. Softly, but his eyes held meaning that went beyond the words. Sarah realized then that the dinner was not simply a reunion. It was a return, and returns often came with consequences. Later, Omar stepped out to take a call. Yusuf remained seated, hands folded, eyes distant. Sarah sat across from him, unsure what to say, unsure what she felt. She told herself she was imagining things, reading too much into small gestures and half-spoken lines. But her instincts disagreed. Yusuf finally spoke again. "Some people enter your life for a reason," he said quietly, "even if they arrive late." Sarah felt her breath catch. She did not respond. She could not trust her voice. When Omar returned, the air between them had changed. Sarah sensed it immediately. Whatever had been building throughout the evening had reached a silent turning point. She didn't know what it meant yet, but she knew one thing clearly. This dinner was not the beginning of something new. It was the return of something old, and it was already asking to be acknowledged. After the dishes were cleared, the house fell into an unusual quiet. The clatter of plates and the low hum of conversation had left a void, and in that silence, Sarah felt a strange tension. Omar had excused himself to take a phone call, and Yusuf remained seated on the sofa, his posture calm but deliberate, as if he were measuring the space around him. Sarah moved quietly to the other side of the room, unsure why she felt the need to stay close, yet keep a distance. There was an invisible line between them now, a boundary created by unspoken understanding. The air was heavy, and the dim lighting made everything feel more intimate than it should have. Yusuf looked at her, his gaze steady, and for a moment Sarah wanted to turn away, to retreat into the safety of the known, but she could not. He spoke softly, his voice smooth, almost careful. "You care deeply for him, don't you?" he asked, not with curiosity, but with certainty. Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. And she realized that this was the first time someone outside her marriage had acknowledged her love openly. She had always known it, of course, but hearing it spoken aloud made it feel fragile, as if it could break under the weight of words. Yusuf watched her, waiting for something in answer perhaps, or a sign that she understood the depth of what he was saying. Sarah found her voice after a moment. "I do," she said simply, and the words felt heavier than she expected. There was an honesty to speaking aloud what she had carried silently for years. Yusuf nodded again, slowly, as if confirming something he already suspected. "He's lucky," he said, and his tone carried no judgment, only observation. "Not everyone finds peace." The sentence hung between them, soft but sharp, like the quiet echo of something long forgotten. Sarah absorbed it, feeling the warmth of it, the acknowledgement that she had lived her love genuinely. Even if it had not always been perfect, the conversation paused then, not because they lacked words, but because words seemed inadequate. They were alone, yet the presence of Omar lingered in the space like a shadow. Sarah felt it, an invisible reminder of the life she had built, the commitment she had made, and the trust she had placed in her husband. But alongside that reminder was a new awareness, subtle and persistent. The past could never be fully ignored. It lingered in the stories, in the memories, and now in the quiet way Yusuf looked at her. Moments passed. The faint ticking of the wall clock became louder than usual, or perhaps Sarah only noticed it more. Every small sound, the shifting of chairs, the distant hum of traffic outside, the soft rustle of Yusuf's clothing was amplified. It was as if time had slowed, and the house itself held its breath, waiting for something to happen. Sarah felt her heart beat faster, not in fear, but in anticipation. She could not name what she was anticipating. She only knew that something had shifted and that the ordinary walls of her living room no longer felt safe in the way they once had. Yusuf's words returned, gentle and deliberate. "Seeing him again, it reminds me of things we left behind," he said, his voice low. He looked down for a moment, thoughtful, then raised his eyes to meet hers. Sarah sensed there was meaning behind the words she could not fully grasp. She nodded, not because she understood, but because she felt the weight of his emotions mirrored in her own. She had never known Omar's past so intimately, had never been included in the memories he shared with friends who had known him before her. Yet, now she was seeing fragments, and they were unsettlingly close. Like threads of a tapestry she was only beginning to glimpse. Sarah could hear Omar on the balcony through the partially open window, his voice low and muffled as he spoke to Yusuf. She did not move closer to listen intentionally, but the words drifted to her despite herself. "She deserves the truth," Yusuf said quietly. Omar replied, "Not now." The voices were brief, almost casual, but the weight of what was being said sank into Sarah's chest like a stone. She felt a tightening, a cold knot of uncertainty. Her mind raced, trying to understand the context, to interpret the tone, to guess what had been left unsaid. Was impossible. Only fragments reached her, yet they were enough to disturb the calm she had assumed existed. When Omar returned to the room, his composure was slightly altered. There was a tension in his movements, a quiet hesitation in his tone, a subtle tightness around his eyes. He smiled at Sarah, but it was different, now polished, careful, and fragile. She asked if everything was okay, trying to keep her voice steady. "Yes," he said, too quickly, too assuredly. His answer only made the room feel heavier. Sarah realized she could no longer ignore the undercurrent between him and Yusuf. Something had shifted, and she felt the first pangs of the realization that she was standing at the edge of a situation she had never prepared for. The night deepened. The conversation dwindled to polite exchanges and quiet gestures. Yusuf seemed to sense the fragility of the moment, speaking with measured words, often leaving space between sentences as if letting them settle in the room. He shared stories lightly, anecdotes from his youth, the kind of harmless memories one tells to connect, but each story carried a subtle weight that Sarah could not ignore. She began to notice how often he glanced at Omar, not with judgment, but with a familiarity that was intimate, a shared understanding she could not fully penetrate. She felt like a newcomer looking into a secret room, seeing things not meant to be shared with her. Sarah tried to focus on the present, on the warmth of the room, on the comfort of routine she had always relied on. She tried to smile, to nod, to engage politely, but her mind was alert, noticing the smallest shifts in posture, the faintest changes in tone, the hidden significance of glances and pauses. Every laugh now seemed loaded with history, every gesture heavy with emotion. She realized that the past had returned, not as a story, but as a living presence, quietly claiming its place at the table. Then Yusuf spoke something that stopped Sarah entirely. Some people enter your life for a reason, even if they arrive late. The sentence was calm, simple, but it carried layers she could not unpack. Her chest tightened and her mind spun. Was he speaking of Omar? Of her? Or of the invisible lines that connected them all? She did not answer. She could not. Words felt inadequate, as though any response would shatter the delicate tension that had settled in the room. She only nodded slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement. A quiet concession that she understood more than she could admit aloud. The night stretched on, and Sarah felt her awareness sharpen to every detail. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the subtle creak of the floorboards, the distant sound of a car passing, everything seemed amplified in the quiet. She became conscious of Omar's absence moments ago and Yusuf's presence now, of the invisible distance and the unspoken connection between them. Her heart ached softly, not with anger, not with fear, but with a tender awareness that things were no longer simple. The ordinary had become layered with memory, emotion, subtle longing. She noticed the smallest details, how Yusuf's eyes lingered just a moment too long on her hands, how he shifted slightly closer when she spoke, how his silence seemed to carry a weight heavier than words. She realized that she was being seen in a way she had never experienced before. Not as a wife, not as a host, but as someone who mattered in a story she had only glimpsed. The sensation was unsettling, yet strangely intoxicating. It made her aware of her own heart, her own emotions, in a way that she had not considered in years. When Omar finally returned from his phone call, the room felt smaller, the air tighter. His movements were deliberate, careful, as if he were navigating a space he could no longer fully claim. He smiled at Sarah, but she noticed the subtle differences, the hesitation, the fleeting doubt, the unspoken recognition of what had passed. In his absence, it was a small smile, fragile and careful, but it told her that he knew she had felt something shift. She did not speak of it, and neither did he. The silence settled again. It's comfortable in appearance, but layered with unspoken understanding. Yusuf continued to speak, now in a quieter tone, reflecting on the past. But his attention occasionally flickered to Sarah, as if testing, measuring, gauging. She could feel the weight of his gaze, the subtle intensity that made the hair on the back of her neck rise. 'Twas not threatening. 'Twas simply a recognition of connection, a subtle awareness that the past could never truly leave, and that its echoes had arrived in her living room. She felt an unfamiliar awareness of herself, her emotions, her own presence in a space that had once been predictable and safe. The night wound down slowly. Sarah felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration, a delicate tension that made it hard to sit still. She noticed Omar glancing at his watch, a polite reminder of time passing, yet the weight of the unspoken remained. Yusuf's presence seemed to linger even as he moved to leave. He spoke briefly, softly, without looking for answers. "Think carefully about what you feel," he said, a quiet instruction more than a suggestion. Sarah nodded, feeling the subtle sting of realization. She understood, in a sudden, piercing way, that the evening had changed her perception of everything. It had peeled back a layer she had not known existed, exposing a depth of emotion and history she could not ignore. When the door closed behind Yusuf, the house felt different. The shadows seemed longer, the silence heavier, and Sarah's chest ached with the quiet knowledge of what had. The morning sunlight fell gently through the curtains, softening the edges of the living room. Sarah sat on the sofa, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she barely touched. The night's events had left her mind restless, her heart unsettled, and her thoughts tangled in emotions she could not easily name. The house felt unusually quiet, as if it too were reflecting on the intensity of the previous evening. Omar had already gone to check on Yusuf, or perhaps to ensure he had left safely, but Sarah did not know for certain. She only knew that the silence had a weight she could not ignore. Moments passed before the door opened and Yusuf stepped inside. His posture calm, his expression thoughtful. He had come to say goodbye, but there was a subtle pause in the air, a quiet acknowledgement of the tension that remained. He looked at Sarah, and for a brief moment she felt the same pull she had sensed the night before, an unspoken connection, delicate and profound. "Be honest with yourself," he said softly, almost gently, his voice carrying the same weight as the night before. "You feel it too?" Sarah did not reply. She did not need to. The words hung between them, simple, calm, yet layered with meaning. She understood without having to speak. Her instincts had already recognized the truth she had been hesitant to face. Omar's presence lingered somewhere in the background, unspoken yet implied, and Sarah felt a mixture of longing and heartbreak, a painful awareness that love, in its quiet forms, could hurt as deeply as betrayal. Yusuf stepped out, leaving the door slightly ajar as if to mark the transition. The subtle sound of it closing was almost final, yet the space it left behind felt charged. Sarah sat silently, her mind replaying his words over and over. They were simple, yet they resonated in ways she could not articulate. She realized that she had been standing on the edge of understanding, that the previous night had revealed a layer of her life she had not seen before. Love, trust, and history had intertwined in ways that were both beautiful and painful. Omar returned to the living room shortly after, his expression unreadable. He moved slowly, deliberately aware of the invisible weight in the room. Sarah stood and faced him, her hands clasped in front of her, steady yet trembling. She did not speak immediately. Instead, she let a long silence pass, letting him feel the significance of the moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, controlled, but carried a depth that could not be ignored. "We need to talk," she said softly, the simplicity of the sentence masking the emotional intensity behind it. Omar nodded, a flicker of unease crossing his features. He knew the dinner had shifted something, though he might not yet fully understand the depth of it. He moved closer, settling into the space beside her, yet careful to leave a respectful distance. The room seemed smaller now, the air thicker, charged with the unspoken truths that had begun to emerge the night before. Sarah felt the gravity of this conversation pressing on her chest, a quiet but undeniable weight that demanded honesty, reflection, and courage. She began by asking the questions she had held back, each one deliberate, calm, and measured. "What did you mean last night? When Yusuf spoke about the past, about truths?" Her voice faltered for the briefest moment, but she regained control immediately. "I need to understand, Omar. I need to know what exists between you and him." Omar's face shifted, a mixture of guilt, recognition, and relief crossing his features. He had not anticipated that Sarah would confront him so directly, nor that she would have sensed the subtleties he thought were hidden. He exhaled quietly, almost a sigh of release. "It's complicated," he began, his voice low, almost hesitant. "Yusuf, we've shared a bond for years. Before our life together. I never stopped caring in some ways. I never meant to hide it from you, but I didn't know how to. How to explain it." Sarah listened intently, every word sinking deep. She felt the familiar ache of love, mixed with the sharp sting of betrayal, not physical. Not in action, but in the lingering emotional threads that had never fully untangled. She realized then that infidelity was not always visible, not always dramatic. Sometimes it existed quietly, in connections unspoken, in shared memories, in emotions that remained despite the passage of time. Omar continued, speaking slowly, choosing his words carefully. "I never acted on it," he said. "I never touched him, not physically, but I didn't let go either. And Yusuf, he reminded me of what I once was, what I once felt. It was never about you not being enough. It's about parts of myself I had never fully reconciled. Sarah absorbed the words, feeling both relief and heartbreak simultaneously. Relief that nothing physical had crossed the line. Heartbreak that an emotional attachment had existed beneath the surface for years. She realized that love was complex, layered, and not always easy to define. Omar had not cheated in the way she had feared, yet the betrayal of hidden emotions was just as potent, just as capable of shaking the foundations of trust. For a long moment, silence settled between them. The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of life outside, the distant sound of traffic and the occasional creak of the floorboards. Sarah felt the full weight of her own emotions, hurt, confusion, but also a strange clarity. She understood now that love required constant choice, constant honesty, and courage to confront even the most uncomfortable truths. She looked at Omar, really looked at him, and saw a man both vulnerable and sincere, flawed yet deeply human. "I need time," she said finally, her voice soft but resolute. "Time to process, time to understand what this means for us." Her words were not an accusation. They were a request, a boundary, a gentle acknowledgement of the fragility of their situation. Omar nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing. Slightly, he understood, perhaps for the first time fully, that transparency and patience were now essential. Days passed and the house felt different. Every glance, every casual touch carried subtle weight. Sarah and Omar navigated the unspoken truths with care, learning to speak openly about fears, memories, and emotions they had previously left unexamined. The presence of Yusuf lingered like a soft echo, a reminder that the past could shape the present. That unspoken bonds could influence the heart in unexpected ways. Sarah found herself reflecting often, not only on Omar but on her own feelings. She realized that love was not only about comfort or routine, it was about understanding, forgiveness, and conscious choice. She thought about Yusuf's visit, about the quiet power of his words, and about the way he had forced a confrontation with the hidden layers of her marriage. It had been unsettling, even painful, but ultimately enlightening. One evening, as Omar returned from work, Sarah felt the shift fully. She greeted him with a calm smile, her heart steady. She knew that the trust between them had been tested, stretched, but not broken. "We're stronger than we realize," she said softly, not as reassurance, but as a truth she now understood. Omar met her eyes, a faint, grateful smile forming. He nodded. "Yes," he said, "we are." The weeks that followed were quiet, yet filled with subtle growth. Conversations that had once been casual became more intentional. Shared memories were discussed openly, not hidden, and feelings that had been suppressed were finally expressed. Sarah noticed the way Omar's attentiveness deepened, the gentle care in his gestures, the way he seemed to cherish not just her presence, but her understanding of his complexities. For Sarah, the experience became a lesson in emotional depth. She realized that love was not always simple, that bonds could be complicated, and that forgiveness did not mean forgetting. It meant understanding and choosing to continue despite awareness of imperfection. She also recognized her own capacity for empathy, for patience, and for navigating emotional landscapes with grace. Months later, the memory of that dinner remained vivid, not as a wound, but as a turning point. Yusuf's brief presence had revealed truths that could not be ignored. It had forced reflection, dialogue, and honesty. And though the echoes of the past lingered, they no longer held power to destabilize. Instead, they became markers of growth, reminders that love required continual engagement and attention. Sarah and Omar continued their life together, changed but not broken. Their connection deepened, strengthened by the acknowledgement of hidden histories, by confronting emotional complexity, and by choosing daily to nurture trust. Sarah understood that love, in its most resilient form, was not merely about passion or romance, it was about navigating the quiet challenges, embracing vulnerability, and committing to honesty even when it was uncomfortable. One evening, Sarah sat by the window, the sun casting a warm glow over the room. She reflected on the journey, the quiet tension of that first dinner, the revelation of emotional truth, and the gradual conscious rebuilding of connection. She smiled softly, mix of relief and contentment, knowing that while the past could visit unannounced, the present and future were theirs to shape. She felt the depth of her own heart, steady and aware, capable of understanding both pain and love simultaneously. The house, once heavy with unspoken tension, now held a quiet serenity. Every corner seemed infused with lessons learned, with awareness sharpened, and with the delicate balance of trust restored. Sarah realized that the most profound transformations often arrived unexpectedly, through small gestures, fleeting conversations, and quiet observations. Love, she now understood, required not only presence but insight, not only